comrades. And yeah, the first thing I wanted to say is thank you very much for having me here. It's a real pleasure to be here in Toronto. It's the first time I've ever been to Toronto, first time I've seen the centre, very impressive centre. And I look forward to getting to know you a bit better over the course of this evening and perhaps the weekend as well. Coincidentally, it's actually a very good, aside from it being Charles Darwin's birthday, it's also quite a convenient time to be discussing this topic of the crisis in Europe, the crisis of European capitalism. Because earlier on today, the leaders of all 27 member states of the European Union met in a castle, a castle apparently set up by Teutonic Knights in Belgium somewhere, surrounded by a moat, which is, I think, is very appropriate. It really conveys the state of siege that the leaders of Europe find themselves in at this time. And the reason they're having this summit in this Belgian castle was to discuss how Europe can recover, pick itself up from a series of really monumental blows. Most important of which, I'd say, the crisis that emerged over Greenland, Trump's threats to annex Greenland, even militarily, from Denmark, a NATO ally, member of the European Union, is, I think, a genuine turning point in the situation. Macron himself referred to it as the Greenland moment, when the European ruling class finally realized that they were not dealing with a short-lived ephemeral phase, simply a mood of Trump, but they were forced to recognize that now the United States is not so much an ally, more an adversary, if not a hostile power. This was actually something explicitly recognized by somebody called Tom Enders, who's he's the head, actually, of the German Council on Foreign Relations. He said, "We can't close our eyes to the fact that the United States is now an adversary." This was building up for some time, over the past 12 months. I mean, the last time I was in Canada at the Montreal Winter School, J.D. Vance, I think more or less at the same time as the event, had stood up at the Munich Security Conference and basically said the biggest problem for European security is your lack of democracy, your suppression of right populist parties, he didn't call that freedom-loving patriots in Europe. And he basically gave the leaders of Europe open-mouthed a stern lecture in democratic values. We've shortly after that, in fact, I think at the same time as that, Putin started negotiating directly with Putin to try to find an end to the war in Ukraine, over the heads not only of Zelensky, but of the European leaders, at the same time that he was saying that Europe is going to have to start footing the bill. This is obviously a trend that's only continued over the last 12 months. But really, the crisis that emerged over Greenland was the real nail in the coffin of the transatlantic alliance. This is also after the US president published a national security strategy document. I don't know if you read it. I definitely recommend that you read it. But I thought it's very significant what it has to say about Europe. It talks, to summarize, it basically says pretty much explicitly that US imperialism is now going to encourage nationalist parties in Europe and also open up European markets. What opening up European markets means is breaking the power of the European single market as a bloc directed against outside capital. It also wants greater freedoms for tech companies to avoid European regulation. But there's one particular line in the security document related to Europe that it struck me because I found it slightly strangely drafted, but I think it's quite significant in its meaning. We will need a strong Europe to help us to successfully compete and to work in concert with us to prevent any adversary from dominating Europe. And the reason why I thought that was interesting, because it seems to me to be saying that the idea that Europe could dominate Europe is just ruled out from the beginning. Russia maybe can dominate Europe or parts of it. China could dominate Europe. That's certainly the main adversary of US imperialism. So the role of America's European allies is to help it prevent the Chinese and Russians getting a foothold. And the conclusion of this, which now the Europeans are drawing, is that the European Union and Europe itself is not, in this period of great power rivalry and power blocks being carved up, the European Union and Europe is not itself a great power competing on the world stage, but rather a field for competition between the great powers. In other words, they're no longer sat at the table, they're on the table. They're part of this feast for the great powers. And that's something, as you can probably imagine, has horrified the European ruling class. We were talking about the rulers of France and Germany, themselves accustomed, particularly France, to being a colonial power. And so they've started talking about the need for European independence. We have to go it alone. We have to assert or reassert our place in the world. I think that the Belgian Prime Minister put it most succinctly when he said, being a happy vassal of America is one thing, being a miserable slave is another. And I'm conscious that this echoes the sentiment, at least, of Mark Carney's now famous speech at Davos, talking about how the previous world order was, I think he says, partly a fiction, but is a fiction that we supported because it benefited us. It's dead, it no longer benefits us, we need to do our own thing. And incidentally, Europe and Canada needs to stand together. So this not only represents a turning point in world relations, I'd say that in relation to Europe, it represents a qualitative, the beginning of a new stage in the historic decline of European imperialism and European capitalism itself, which I must say has been a long, drawn-out process, but we're really seeing an acceleration of this historic process, which has revolutionary implications for Europe and for the world. So to kind of to get onto this question of European decline, as I'm sure you already know, Europe was the first region of the world to industrialize, in which modern capitalism developed. It colonized most of the rest of the world. And so European nations like Britain, France, for a long time had a very privileged position in world capitalism, in the world market. The Second World War led to the destruction of much of the economy of places like Germany and France. The European powers were no longer capable of asserting their own interests, really. Europe laid completely shattered. Britain was preserved some of the destruction of the Second World War, but was utterly dependent on US capital. And what emerged out of the war was an enormously strengthened Soviet Union, which had defeated fascism and spread all the way to what became East Germany. And US imperialism, which was effectively the hegemon, the atlas upon which world imperialism was perched. And initially, and it's in this context that European imperialism effectively saved European capitalism, saved European imperialism. Because threatened by the possible spread of communism in the Soviet Union, the United States eventually stepped in, as we know, with martial aid, but also to create some of the infamous institutions that are part of the so-called liberal rules-based world order. And I think, I don't have time to go into kind of the thorough historical treatment of this, but I think the circumstances in which NATO was set up are interesting and I think quite relevant. At the very end of the Second World War, the original military strategy of US imperialism was, in the event of a war with the Soviet Union, they would retreat out of Europe, basically leave continental Europe to the Soviet Union, and then try to fight the war across the Atlantic. But what happened was, Germany was initially, in 1945, 1946, was left in an absolutely appalling state. People were starving. The French imperialists in particular wanted Germany to remain carved up, wanted the economy to be broken down to just produce, light manufacturing like toys, beer, that kind of thing. But the problem was that raised the prospect of social collapse and revolution and the possibility that Germany might actually fall into the Soviet sphere of influence. At this time, Stalin was actually saying that he was in favor of unification of Germany, even on a capitalist basis. And there are actually private memos that now have been released amongst the inside the ruling circles in US imperialism that said that this was the worst possible scenario, that if a unified Germany joins with the Soviet Union, even if it remains on a capitalist basis, that's basically game over. If German industry joins up with Russian resources and labor, then we will not be able to defeat that force, is what they were worried about. So this is when the idea of rebuilding German industry, Western German industry, really starts to take hold. There was just one problem, though. The French ruling class said, absolutely not, we're not going through this again. We've seen this before. So the only way that US imperialism got the French to agree to what eventually became the Marshall Plan was by promising the French that they would station US troops on the Rhine. And this is where the North Atlantic Treaty actually came from. In other words, NATO was initially targeted not just at the Soviet Union, but actually at Germany, to satisfy the French imperialism, which of course was so weak it wasn't able to defend itself. Of course, with the rebuilding of German industry and with West Germany fully, falling into the Western imperialist fold, eventually the purpose NATO became a weapon directed directly at the Soviet Union. But this is the context in which European capitalism was effectively rebuilt. The funds required to rebuild European industry, to modernize European industry, was largely put forward by the United States. Another very important factor in this is that countries like France and Britain were allowed to retain hold of their colonies and were allowed to squeeze and exploit them in order to aid their own reconstruction and their own profits. US imperialism saw a benefit in letting these faded powers continue to kind of rule over the roost without having to rule them directly. But and then after the collapse of the Soviet Union, German imperialism also begins to expand in the East. Of course, we have so-called decolonization. France didn't rule its colonies directly after 1960, but it continued to oppress and exploit them, as it does in many cases to this day. Germany then pushes to the east. The expansion of the European Union to Central and Eastern European countries was in many ways an expansion of the influence and power of German imperialism. Much of Romanian industry is German companies, German car companies establishing plants in Romania. So huge export of capital. It was, if you like, the heyday of European imperialism, but it was based on a business model of German manufacturing in particular, selling goods to the US and in particular to the growing Chinese market, benefiting from cheap Russian oil and gas. In other words, having a best of both or best of all worlds policy. But something that's been recognized now is that era is definitively over. First of all, the war in Ukraine, in which US imperialism succeeded in dragging. You might remember that France and Germany were quite reticent about joining the war initially, but the US was eventually able to drag them in and cut off oil and gas supplies from Russia, which led to a huge spike in energy prices, which has really undermined German industry. It's accelerated deindustrialization, actually, in the industrial heartland of Europe. In addition to this, the rapid development of Chinese industry, and that not just in terms of toys and light manufacturing, but actually high-tech goods like electric vehicles, has really started to have an impact in Europe. The European car industry is increasingly coming under pressure from Chinese competition, which can produce at a much faster rate, greater scale, and more cheaply. And at the same time, the kind of the final blow is this added pressure from US capitalism. All of a sudden, Trump is saying it's no longer in US interest to keep subsidizing US military. In fact, some in Trump circles are saying it's not just a question of subsidizing the European military, We're subsidizing European health budgets because by not having to pay money on military build-up, European nations like France are able to pay for better social services and better healthcare provision than even workers in America get. Those days are over. The policy of the United States now, as I think we know, and this is slightly outside the scope of this discussion, is to first of all strengthen its position in the Western Hemisphere so that it can focus on the real, most important theatre of operations, which is the Indo-Pacific. The idea of propping up European capitalism in an age without a Soviet Union, where, as far as the United States is concerned, Europe as it is can balance off against Russia, it doesn't make any sense. And they have a point. From the standpoint of US imperialism, the old order does not make any sense. The problem is, it was on those subsidies, if you like, that European imperialism was able to play the role that it had formerly played in the world. So it's like the rug has been pulled from under its feet. And this basically what was going on under the surface was actually quite a long-term economic decline, but which was covered up by Europe's access to its former colonies. For instance, France continued to get cheap uranium from Niger, one of the biggest producers of uranium in the world. Europe still has access to many markets. It's actually, the European Union is actually the world's biggest trader. In goods, if you take goods and services together, it actually takes up a greater proportion of world trade than both the US and China. Not put together, but it's still the number one. That's because of its former position, its former colonial power. It's interesting, actually, Trotsky in the 1920s said something similar about Britain, and France, that the old colonial powers, even though they'd been overtaken in productivity and industry by the likes of the United States and Germany, they still retained a superior position as commercial powers because of their old colonial possessions. But under the surface, there was an economic crisis starting to set in. Ever since, we talk about the crisis in Europe. Europe has been in crisis since 2009. The whole bloc has been paralyzed, basically. And industry has lagged behind. For instance, in the car industry. The car industry is one of the biggest employers in Europe. It's the backbone of German industry and other ancillary industries that serve the car industry. It's specialized in combustion engines and in particular diesel vehicles. However, the new trend is towards electric vehicles, and that's only set to continue. And Europe is completely lagged behind. All its factories are set up to produce combustion engines. And there's a complete lack of investment to be able to catch up with the likes of Tesla, BYD in China. And we're actually seeing a reduction in investment, both flows of investment into Europe and flows of investment within the EU itself are in decline over the last couple of years. So you have a ruling class that is sitting on actually quite a lot of savings, but is not prepared to invest. Why would European capitalists invest in creating, I don't know, a French EV maker, when the likes of Tesla and BYD, of course, heavily subsidized by the Chinese state. Tesla also receives various subsidies in order to be a dominant monopoly on the world stage. How are they going to compete with that? At the same time, the European states are incapable of boosting industry with a huge injection of state subsidies and investment. Germany is the only country which is in remotely a position to do that, with debt to GDP of about 63%, whereas France, Spain, Italy, Belgium all have debt to GDP ratios of over 100%. So the picture I'm trying to paint is of paralysis, really, and a gradual erosion of the economic base upon which European imperialism has been based. That's a big part of where this dependency on the United States comes from. Another aspect, of course, is the dependency on the United States as their most important market for their goods. But I want to also touch on why this paralysis? Why is it that European capitalism has been more paralyzed than, say, the USA? We're talking about a global crisis of capitalism. But I would say that Europe is experiencing a special crisis because of the character of Europe itself. Europe, as we know, is not a single capitalist nation state with a single capital market with huge continent-wide monopolies that can become champions, if you like, of European capitalism. There isn't a European Tesla. Europe is a collection of single capitalist states that have evolved over centuries, and each have their own capitalist classes, each have their own markets. I know that there's a single market in Europe, but there's still internal capitalist markets, and ruling classes that have their own interests, their own monopolies, your likes of your Volkswagens, your BMWs, your Renaults, and each want to protect their own national industries despite the fact they're all locked together in a single block. So you have this strange situation of capitalism trying itself to overcome the bourgeois nation state. The bourgeois nation state was at one point an immensely progressive factor in the development of, society, of production, and of capitalism in particular. Lenin talks about how within Germany you had hundreds of different toll systems, hundreds of different weights and measures systems, which made trade impossible. Now you have that on a continental scale. There's a certain amount of marrying up of measures, weights and measures, but you still have masses of different regulations that restrict the flow of capital. Europe is not like the United States. It's not like China. And so how can they create the gigantic monopolies capable of competing on a global scale? This is actually something that Mario Draghi, who was an Italian prime minister, he was the president of the European Central Bank, spelled out in a report where he was talking about how Europe was lagging behind. And one of the main points he said was that there's a lack of integration of European capital markets. That means that the level of investment that you can kind of focus on a single point is much more limited than in the United States, despite the fact that there is a lot of capital within the European economy. He also talks about how you don't have these gigantic industrial champions that are capable of standing up to the likes of Tesla. His solution is to basically integrate the European economy even further. But the problem is you don't overcome the contradictions between the different nation states. The different interests of, say, France and Germany are not overcome simply by forcing them close together. In fact, actually, that's creating more friction, I would say. And I'm going to touch on that in a minute. And so added to this economic decline, there is perhaps something even more worrying for the rulers of Europe at this stage, which is their geopolitical decline. I mentioned already that Europe actually remains the world's biggest trader. The biggest trade partner for Africa as a whole, so not sub-Saharan Africa, but Africa as a whole, is still the European Union. If you add Britain to Europe, then it pulls even further ahead. The biggest trade partner for India, which is a huge growing market, is the European Union. So you look at that and you think, wow, Europe must be in a strong position then. The problem is, this is a product of the past and is already being undermined. It's been undermined by Europeans' lack of competitiveness. Already China is starting to enter the Indian car market, even though India has put up lots of tariffs against Chinese cars. They don't actually want to be flooded with Chinese goods. But on the geopolitical stage, some of the clout, the imperialist clout that Europe has used to obtain these markets, such as the African market, I think we can all know where Europe's position in the African market has come from, that is now being challenged and undermined. So in Africa specifically, France has suffered a number of very important defeats. The French military has been kicked out of a number of countries in West Africa. Russia has been invited into a number of these countries that have also asked Russia for investment, are turning towards Russia. That doesn't mean that they exclusively turn towards Russia or they simply become puppets of Russia. I would say that's an exaggeration. But certainly there is a mood across Africa of hatred towards the old colonial powers for very obvious reasons, imbued also with a sense that African countries can now play the field a bit, can establish trade agreements with other powers. They're no longer bound, they're no longer so dependent on French imperialism. In the past, France would sell high-tech goods and military equipment like helicopters, and in return would get cheap raw materials for its industry. That cycle has begun to be broken, which has enormously negative implications for the strength of French capitalism. I mentioned Germany in Eastern Europe. It was a captive market, it was a source of cheap labor, it was a field for investment, important for German imperialism. The war in Ukraine is starting to shift the balance of power a bit in Eastern Europe. The whole purpose of the Ukraine war, from the standpoint of Western imperialism, was to weaken Russia, to inflict military defeats on it, maybe even to overthrow Putin, establish a puppet regime. At one point, they were even talking about breaking up Russia as a country, which, of course, would eliminate it as a rival. That, of course, is not what's happened. The Russian military has actually emerged from the conflict, or is emerging from the conflict, strengthened. They've had to develop, on the fly, a drone industry, which is now more advanced, quite a lot more advanced than the European drone industry. They've had to mobilize hundreds of thousands of troops. So they now have a large force in the field, which is going toe-to-toe and defeating a NATO-trained and equipped force with the resources of America and Europe behind it. This is a pretty catastrophic scenario for Europe, not because Russia is going to invade and sweep the whole of the European continent, which in Europe, that's what we're told. In Britain, we're told to expect, nuclear warheads being fired at London and stuff like that. This is a line to justify the campaign of militarism that the European ruling classes are starting to push in place. Germany, they're starting to talk about conscription for the first time since the Second World War. And a French general, it was an admiral or a general, said, French people are going to have to get used to their children dying in war to prepare the population for imperialist war. The reason that they're so terrified is I do not think that this French admiral thinks that Russia is going to invade France. But what they do think is that Russia is, in relation to France, Russia is challenging them in Africa. And in Germany, they cancelled the presidential election in Romania because a pro-Russian candidate was about to win. Hungary is consistently voting against the rest of the EU leaders on the question of Russia. It's quite openly turning towards Russia. Slovakia also has turned towards Russia. And there's the prospect of, Austria has maintained a neutral stance, but is being pulled in two different directions. And there are parties with mass influence in the Baltic states. At the moment, the governments of the Baltic states are very anti-Russia, but there are parties with mass influence in the Baltic states that are looking towards Russia and want peace, basically, want a realignment of relations. If this trend continues, and a strengthened Russia would only add to that, then some of the fields, some of the kind of captive markets and fields for investment that Germany has in Eastern Europe would be significantly challenged. This is also a big worry for Poland as well. And so Europe is in a position where it's seen as incapable of projecting itself militarily because it's been dependent on America, that is now starting to pull out. It's seen as sluggish and uncompetitive. Just on the military question, even Zelensky, who now depends on Europe in order to be able to continue fighting the war, he stood up at Davos and basically just took the mick out of them, said, you are just, at one point I think he referred to Europe as a salad of small powers. A salad. For him to stand up and insult these European leaders, it gives you an indication of the contempt, frankly, that these individual so-called middle powers, I'm not sure whether they actually classify as middle powers, are seen in the rest of the world. This is a really shocking scenario. One thing I want to briefly touch upon is Europe doesn't have its own access to strategic minerals, such as rare earth metals and stuff like that. And so the European Union has been explicitly trying to find a policy of mineral independence. And each time it's been thwarted because it's a weakling, a geopolitical weakling. I'll give you one example. In either 2021 or early 2022, just before the Ukraine war started, the EU signed a minerals deal with Ukraine to have access to its mineral reserves. That has now been rendered null and void, not only by the Russian invasion, but by the deal that Trump signed with Zelensky at the point of a gun, which basically signs away all of Ukraine's remaining minerals that aren't under Russian control. So Europe has just been completely frozen out. Last year, Europe signed a deal with Rwanda for access to its minerals, which is, of course, a euphemism, because by that it means the Congo's minerals that Rwanda is currently plundering. That has now been cut across by the deal signed by Trump with Paul Kagame and Etienne Tshisekedi, the leaders of the DRC and Rwanda, again, to sell Congolese minerals that are then processed through Rwanda. So again, Europe has no say in this. Europe has no place. And without access to these strategic materials, obviously, Europe is going to be dependent on China, which dominates refining of these minerals, and the US. So it's in a position where I would say, if I was going to make a prediction about Europe's trade position, it will cease to be the world's biggest trader. It will still be a major trader, but at some point it is going to be overtaken and swallowed effectively by the great powers. And when that happens, the prospect for the European economy is absolutely dire. In fact, already Europe is going through a process of, I was going to say deindustrialization, further deindustrialization. Germany is beginning to deindustrialize. This was one of the major industrial powerhouses of the world, and certainly of Europe. Over 1 million industrial jobs were lost, even between 2021 and 2023. So that number has only increased since then. And there have been announced job cuts of hundreds of thousands at companies like Volkswagen, Bosch, which produces washing machines and stuff like that. So what I'm trying to get across with this list of facts, I hope I've given a bit more analysis than that, but the picture I'm trying to paint is of a situation in which European capitalism is in rapid decline, something that is being recognized by their own leaders. So the next question is, well, what are they trying to do about it then? What projects are they talking about this summit in this Belgian castle? The first thing is, you might have noticed they've been striking very big or big-sounding trade deals. They signed a trade deal with the South American trade bloc, Mercosur. They've also just announced, they haven't signed it, but they've announced what Ursula von der Leyen, the head of the European Commission, called the mother of all trade deals with the Modi government in India. So clearly they're trying to shore up their trade position by getting access to big and growing markets, particularly India, for European goods. But is this going to be enough? In relation to India, the deal is extremely diluted. In fact, the European Union suspended negotiations of this deal since 2013 because it thought the deal was too weak, it wasn't worth it. All of a sudden, they've resumed talks in 2022 after the Ukraine war started, and now they're boasting about how they signed this wonderful deal, where lots of sectors are excluded. In terms of European cars, that's one kind of victory they've been proclaiming. There's actually a quota on the number of cars that the Europeans can sell with these lower tariffs. And it doesn't include electric vehicles, which, of course, the future growth market. So it's a bit more, to be honest, it's a bit of a propaganda win. It's not going to prevent the encroaching dominance of the US and China. And I think it's quite significant that only about a week after the Europeans announced their deal, Trump announced some deal that he'd seemingly just come up with Modi, saying this is going to be an even better deal. We'll obviously have to see what the details of this deal is. But it underlines the point that Europe simply isn't able to jostle with and push out the way these genuine major powers. As for the Mercosur deal, this highlights a key aspect of the crisis of Europe, something that's different to the crisis in other countries, which is that the European powers are at odds with each other. The European Union is incapable of having a single united front. They've been negotiating this Mercosur deal for 25 years. The reason it took so long is because there's a large agricultural sector in South America, and European farmers do not want to be undercut by South America, Argentinian beef, for instance. And so there's a very large pressure group within European states saying, if you sign this deal, it's going to destroy agriculture, it's going to throw lots of farmers out of business. You've had demonstrations of farmers in their tractors in European capitals. Now, if you are a government in France or Belgium, going against the farmers is a very bad idea. It basically means you're not going to get elected, which means that Macron in France, one of the most important European countries, has been persistently against this and trying to sabotage the deal. Meanwhile, Germany, a major industrial power which wants to export industrial goods to South America, has been desperately trying to push this deal through for over 20 years. The outcome was they finally signed it, and then immediately the European Parliament has suspended it. They sent it to the European Courts of Justice for a legal opinion. A legal opinion in Europe takes 18 months, 2 years. So they basically kicked it into the long grass. In the meantime, the United States have said, we're not happy about this deal because it means European cheese is going to undercut American cheese. So they're going to put more pressure. Bearing in mind this whole new Don Roe doctrine, we don't want non-hemispheric actors getting a foothold in South America. It's a race against time, basically, assuming that Europe even could maintain this foothold. So you see that the fact that Europe is not a single united bourgeois state means it cannot compete on the same level. Thank you. What else are they proposing to do? One of the main, and again, we see this split between German and French capitalism in particular, on this question of Eurobonds. What I mean by Eurobonds is a single debt for the whole European Union. So Germany has recently announced that it's going to borrow a huge amount, billions, hundreds of billions, I think, in order to invest in industry and in defence. The European Union has suspended its regulations on borrowing. There's this rule that's never applied that you're supposed to have a deficit of less than 3%. That's not the case in the vast majority of countries. But they've suspended rules on borrowing for defence spending because it's seen as an emergency, something that's urgently needed, but not on spending to subsidise or set up, modernise industry. France has a problem because France has over 100% debt to GDP and is desperately trying to find places to cut. So France can't inject hundreds of billions of euros into just building French industries from scratch. Germany is in more of a position to do that. So, surprise, surprise, Emmanuel Macron, just before this summit, said we need to act decisively, we need to have a programme of European-wide debt. To do what exactly? For Germany to pay to establish industries and factories in France. That's what he's talking about. That's what everybody knows. And so Friedrich Merz, who's the Chancellor of Germany, has said, we've been there before, we've seen this one before, we're not going to support Eurobonds. We have to be more competitive. And so, again, you see these clashing interests at play. So as a result, they've emerged from this castle. I imagine, in my mind's eye, I'm imagining that scene in Succession where they're in that Hungarian castle. Have you seen it, the one boar on the floor? That's how I pictured this summit, because they emerge out and they have announced nothing. No Eurobonds, no deregulation, although they're in favour of deregulation, because they cannot come to an agreement. On the subject of deregulation, one other thing that Macron's proposed, Macron, I find, is a real peddler of an empty phrase. If you want an empty phrase, you go to Emmanuel Macron. And one empty phrase is he is putting forward a policy of protection without protectionism. Protection without protectionism is Germany borrows in order to pay for French factories. But I don't understand his policy. He also wants higher tariffs on Chinese goods. I don't see how that's protection without protectionism. That seems to be straight up protectionism, as far as I'm aware. Again, Germany doesn't like that because the German car industry has a lot of plants in China and also trades a lot with China. And car manufacturers, not just German manufacturers, by the way, but European car manufacturers are terrified that if they slap tariffs on Chinese goods, the Chinese are going to slap tariffs on them, which is going to undercut one of their most important markets. So again, it's a picture of paralysis. Germany and the northern European states, I'm talking about Sweden, Netherlands, those kind of states, are talking about the need to become competitive. And one way they need to become competitive is through deregulation. A big part of that is environmental regulations. They want to strip those away. But another thing is something that is referred to in European law as gold plating. So one of the ideas of the single market is that you just have one set of regulations, so everyone competes on the same level playing field. If that's actually enforced, that means that the biggest monopolies that can produce with a better economy of scale, that can produce more cheaply, are going to dominate the market. But in practice, that's not what happens, because states apply what's called gold plating. The reason it's called that is because on top of the basic regulations, they then slap added regulations on top. So I read one thing, that a truck in Belgium can carry 44 tons, and then when it crosses the border to France, it can only carry 40 tons. So they either have to just meet the French standard or they have to unload the truck partially just to get through to Belgium. It reminds me of that story that Lenin told about merchants in the 16th century having to pass through different toll gates. But no longer is it sort of duchies within Germany, it's entire nations. But it shows how backward European capitalism itself has become. It's an artifact, a relic. So they want to strip away these regulations. What that means is intensified competition within Europe. I saw something, and I guess as Canadians, you're probably I think this is quite similar to Canada. The comrades have told me that there's actually less trade between Canadian provinces than with the United States. It's not quite as intense in Europe, which isn't quite as close to the United States, but there are so many frictions between European states that they say it amounts to a 65% tariff. That's on goods. On services, it amounts to a 110% tariff. You can qualify as a lawyer, for instance, in one country and not practice in other European states. And so as a result, the internal dynamism is the words they use it in the bourgeois media is really sapped. That's one reason, by the way, that the Germans and the French in particular were able to get on with each other. It was a happy marriage for a period because France looked south towards Africa and the Mediterranean. Germany looked east towards Eastern Europe. If they lose these sphere of influences, even partially, they have to turn towards the European market. It's a big potential market. Wealthy, relatively wealthy part of the world, disposable income. They're going to want a bigger slice, but that means German companies encroaching on Italian companies, French companies, that only the strongest can ultimately survive. And that means that the weaker bourgeoisie, and I would say the French are in a weaker position here, are going to have to lose out. Now, are they going to be prepared to tolerate that? I don't think so. And I think that's precisely why Macron is talking about tariffs and German debt to pay for French development, because they desperately want to avoid becoming irrelevant. One thing that's interesting is that for the kind of the weaker bourgeoisies, they don't mind Chinese companies taking over in order to keep jobs. Volvo in Sweden, it hires 20,000 people. A Chinese company bought it, and they've kept the jobs, so they're happy. An ex-CEO of Stellantis, which is a major car manufacturer, said that China is going to save a lot of the European car jobs, but it's basically going to destroy the European competitors. So the reason this is particularly scary for France is because it's a direct attack not only on French employment, but on the French bourgeoisie itself. Effectively, we're talking about approaching a semi-colonial situation, really. There's a way to go before Europe becomes a semi-colony, but it kind of fits in with this picture of basically being on the table to be carved up by the different powers. There's another question here that, how is the European Union, and I think Canada's in a similar position, how is the European Union going to play a truly independent role that can kind of shirk any pressure from the United States if it depends on the United States as its single biggest export market? 20% of European trade goes to the United States. They're not going to be able to recoup that from South America and India. As a result, if Europe is doing something that Trump doesn't like, he will be able to apply pressure. He'll be able to squeeze with tariffs. We've already seen this. And Europe actually had to back down the last time he applied tariffs and accept these so-called retaliatory tariffs. Likewise, Europe is still heavily dependent on American technology, particularly in many aspects, particularly military technology. But one thing that's very important is software. Big US tech, absolutely, things like Zoom, Microsoft, European companies, European states all depend on this. Now, France has banned public employees from using Zoom. They now have to use a homegrown company. But the idea that Europe is going to be able to wean itself off American technology in anything less than 10 years is a fantasy, which means at exactly the same time that they're coming under attack and having to try to apply a more independent policy, they're going to be tied to the apron strings of US imperialism. So every time they want to tug on those strings, every time they want to tug the leash, they will be able to cause pain to the European bourgeoisie. In other words, their crisis is inescapable. Bear in mind, this is also in conditions of a worldwide crisis of capitalism. We're not talking about a rapidly expanding world market where world trade, there's a growing pie that everyone can get a bigger slice of. If anything, the pie is stagnant or even shrinking. And so there's an expression that Trotsky used, which came to mind in the 30s. It said that in a period of organic crisis, US capitalism, which was of course on the rise at that time, can only continue to expand and progress at the expense of the old European capitalism. I think we're seeing another scenario like that, but with a rising China and with a decrepit old Europe, which is being eaten away. And another very important, so this trap that the European bourgeoisie has put itself in has led them to start to believe in miracles. And the miracle that the leaders of Europe are banking on is defense spending. Now, the war in Ukraine, the withdrawal of American support has necessitated added defense spending from the standpoint of European imperialism. They can't be this military minnow. They have to have force that they can project on a world scale and in their periphery. But in addition to that, European leaders have started talking explicitly about economic growth through defense spending. This is never anything they talked about before. In the past, they said the opposite. They said that the US, the protective umbrella from US imperialism and NATO, gave them a peace dividend. It meant they could invest in their economy because they didn't have to spend money on defense. All of a sudden, that's turned into, we're going to grow the economy through military spending. I think it reminds me of something Lenin said, that a man on the edge of a cliff does not reason. That it's the only thing they can do, for the reasons I've already spelled out. To give you an example, to give you some evidence of what I'm saying, the German defense minister, Klingbeil, has called for better cooperation among member states and has called for firmly embedding defense as a priority in the next EU budget. He then said, turning defence into an engine for growth. And a policymaker from the ECB also said that Europe's planned rises in defence spending could help support GDP growth over the medium term. Now, the thing is, this is not going to work. One thing they're trying to do in Germany is turn closing manufacturing plants into factories for tanks and so on. But everybody has a car. Not many people has a tank. You're not going to be able to replace the car market or washing machine market with tanks. Another thing is that this is not productive investment. The state borrows. Now, Marx explained that state debt is fictitious capital. It's not invested in production in order to accumulate capital. It's basically the state promising future tax income. Takes that debt. It then invests it in building factories which employ workers, pay wages. Those workers then go and buy real commodities in the real economy. But this is all based on fictitious capital. And often these weapons aren't even used. It means that you have a burst of inflation. In maybe even the short term, but certainly in the medium to long term, this is just going to be inflationary. And the thing is, this is not just a result of Marxist analysis. It's not just the Marxists that are saying this. Even bourgeois economists are saying things like, you get less GDP than you spend. This is definitely not something you would do for short-term economic gain. That's someone from the London School of Economics. In other words, the European bourgeoisie has gone on a policy of madness. I would say because they can't do anything else. They're too constrained by debt to actually invest in the real economy, except for Germany. But even then, I think that the benefits of this spending spree by Germany are going to be extremely limited for some of the reasons I've already mentioned. They are too paralyzed by the internal divisions and the contradictions of European capitalism itself to even turn that investment into a positive gain from the standpoint of their place in the world. And their geopolitical weakness is only going to tighten the trap that they find themselves in. And so, what next? But some people are talking about a two-speed Europe. So this idea that, well, those countries that, the more powerful economies, France, Germany, Spain, Italy, they band together, and so they integrate more closely. So the other countries that were vetoing certain things, like Hungary, are left in the cold. But that has two major problems that I can think of. One, it means the sort of second-tier European countries are even more detached from the core, and therefore can be even more easily picked off by the likes of Russia, the United States. It essentially means the de facto breakup of the European Union. It will no longer be the European Union that it was 20 years ago. Another factor is, if you're trying to push the likes of France and Germany even closer together and make them integrate, that's only going to intensify the contradictions I've already spelled out. They cannot come to an agreement because they have fundamentally opposed interests. If you try to fit them together in order to come to a common policy, that's only going to, I would say, that's actually going to exacerbate the crisis and even threaten the collapse of the European Union at a certain stage. But what this means, the most important thing of all is what this means for the class struggle. The fact is that for decades, European capitalism has bought a certain social peace at the expense of the exploitation of its colonies, or former colonies, and subsidies from US imperialism. Both of those are under threat, and European states are already over-indebted and facing financial crisis. What does that mean? That means that the present standard of living of the European masses cannot be afforded by European capitalism anymore. And they've been quite candid about that. They've said, we can't afford our pensions. They've also talked about how European workers work much fewer hours than US workers, about 300 hours per year on average, less than American workers. And if I saw a statistic, the ECB produced a statistic saying that if European workers work the same number of hours as their US counterparts, European GDP per capita would increase by 21%. So in other words, the program for the future is going to be cuts to pensions, cuts to public services, making workers work longer for less in order to be competitive. That process has actually already begun. And what we're seeing is an undermining of the institutions of bourgeois democracy. There is a crisis of the whole regime at the most fundamental level. You've seen this with the rise of right populism, the likes of Rassemblement National in France, Alternative for Deutschland in Germany. These are all nationalist parties that are quite likely going to come to power at a certain stage in the future. They're both polling, they're both the most popular parties, similar to Reform in Britain. Now I ask you, what impact is it going to have on the European Union if the two most important, powerful member states have nationalist Eurosceptic parties? When they come to power, I doubt they'll say, let's just wrap up the European Union, but we want more out of it. The kind of arguments that we're already seeing are only going to be intensified and wrapped up with chauvinist demagogy as well. But that's shift to the right. These parties, when they come to power, they will inevitably expose themselves because they're not actually going to be able to improve the conditions of the masses. The thing that the ruling class is much more scared of than the likes of Le Pen or the Alternative for Deutschland is the working class. Why is it that France has not been able to pass a budget? They had to pass it by using this constitutional clause which basically allows the executive to force through legislation. So they weren't able to pass it by normal means. On the surface, the reason they couldn't pass it is because they couldn't get a majority. That's how it works in Parliament, right? The reason they couldn't get a majority is because no party wants to vote for this budget. Why? Because they would be devastated in a future election. The problem is, not only can they not pass this budget, but the French ruling class has been clear that this budget does not cut hard enough. It needs tens and tens of billions of cuts in order to bring the deficit under control. And the French ruling class is genuinely scared that if they do that, they are going to be faced with a backlash from the French working class that hasn't been seen since 1968. Now, and they've got reason to believe that. We've already seen the Gilets jaunes over unfair taxes directed against working people under the name of environmental taxes. We've seen the huge strike movement against the pension counter-reform, which, by the way, has now been suspended in order to get this budget through. So they're incapable of carrying out these cuts because they know the response is going to be absolutely furious. We've seen the Bloc on Two movement, which exploded due to the rage of the masses at the conditions, the hypocrisy, the corruption, the rottenness of European capitalism. In Italy, we saw the magnificent strike over Palestine, which, yes, was an internationalist political strike, but we can tell that it was clearly fed by a rage at the Italian establishment. Over 1 million people don't come out on strike purely. If they're happy with their government, they don't go on strike against their government's complicity on the same scale, even if they are enraged by what's happening in Palestine. And Giorgia Meloni, the Prime Minister, saw this. She said, this strike is against me. This strike isn't about Palestine. This is against me. And there's an element of truth in that. This is the situation that's already developing. But what I'm trying to get across is this is nothing compared to the class battles that are on the way. If French capitalism continues to be unable to carry out these cuts, either eventually a government's going to come into power which does try to ram these cuts down the throats of the French workers, or you will see a financial crisis, a Greece-style financial crisis in one of the founding member states of the European Union, in which case the IMF or whatever bodies are involved are then going to cram these cuts down the throats of the French workers. But the French workers and the European workers as a whole are in no mood to have any cuts imposed on them whatsoever. What we're looking at is we're looking at the opening up of a prolonged revolutionary period. That is the perspective in Europe. I remember something that Trotsky said about Britain. Obviously, I've already run out of time. I won't go into the details. But in 1925, he pointed out that the British coal industry, which was a very important industry at the time, had lagged behind rivals like Germany, the United States. It needed to be rationalized in order to compete. But they couldn't nationalize it and rationalize it in a planned way because it was in the hands of all these small coal companies that all had their own interests. So he said the only way that the British bourgeoisie is going to be able to rectify the situation, or even try, is by forcing all of the costs onto the shoulders of the working class. But the working class is not going to tolerate this, and we will see revolutionary developments. Less than a year after he wrote those words was the 1926 general strike, in which the workers in Britain could have taken power. What was it over? Not a penny off the pay, not a minute on the day. In other words, a defensive struggle against austerity, attacks on the working class, imposed in order to rectify a situation of declining imperialism and declining capitalism. I would say a similar perspective. I don't mean a general strike within a year. I mean, maybe, touch wood. But I'm not saying that is exactly the perspective, but a perspective of a declining capitalism having to force all the costs onto a working class, an organised working class which is on its feet, undefeated, is the perspective for the current time. So what we're looking at is a period of sharp turns, sudden changes, revolutionary developments at a certain stage in which a powerful revolutionary communist parties can and must be built. I'll finish on that. Thank you.